Well, good evening, everybody. This is my sign to Adam at the back doing the AV work, and it's based on Dennis Law, not on Elon Musk. Welcome to, my name's Graham Watt, I'm a council member. It's a pleasure to welcome you to this, the 8th lecture in the 223rd session of the Royal Philosophical Society of Glasgow. Some housekeeping. Fire exits at the front and the back. You know what to do, but no fire is planned, nor any rehearsal. Toilets down in the basement or disabled next to the front entrance. During the talk tonight, there will be an opportunity to participate electronically with your phone, so have it to hand. And what you can do is access the internet via the Internet University of Glasgow visitor server. And then having done that, if you find on your search facility menti.com, it will give our speaker the opportunity to tune in to what you think on particular issues. So to introduce our speaker, well, nearly 30 years ago, I was sitting in a room in the Wellcome Trust in Euston Road in London, part of a panel interviewing young doctors applying for quite prestigious clinical research fellowships. And one candidate came into the room, a black woman, which was unusual, tall, with an afro haircut, which made her look even taller. And there were three surprises in quick succession. The first was a soft Glasgow accent. I thought she looked like Angela Davis, the civil rights, yeah. But the Glasgow accent didn't fit. And then she wanted to do research in an orphanage, which was pretty unusual then and now. And the third surprise was that the orphanage was in Guatemala. And what's not a surprise is that nearly 30 years later, Helen is the Professor of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry at the University of Glasgow. Not a difficult prediction with that start. She's been made a Fellow of the UK Academy of Medical Sciences, which is as prestigious as you get in terms of medical research. It's not easy to get into. And if you go onto the Academy's website, she's described as, I'll just read it, she has developed the measures, the networks, and the engagement techniques that make rigorous clinical trials possible with abused and neglected children and their families. So Helen has not only been carrying out groundbreaking research, but pioneering the development of the conditions that make such research possible. For good measure, she's a brilliant jazz singer and jazz vocalist. Unfortunately, I don't think we'll hear that tonight. Here we are on the second day of the second presidency of Donald Trump. Only 1,459 days to go. Helen's title is Locusts, Plagues and Other Disasters, to which I've just referred. But I think she's going to leave us on a positive note, why we're made to survive adversity. Helen.
Thank you so much. What an absolutely lovely introduction. Thank you so much. And I'm absolutely honoured to stand in front of this audience. I'm not sure I'm going to help you overcome Donald Trump. That does feel like a tall order. But as Graham said, I've spent my life trying to understand the mental health problems surrounding experiences of abuse and neglect. And yet I've come to this title. And actually, the title that I really wanted to give this lecture, I didn't think you could put in the brochure. Life's a bitch and then you thrive. So we'll see. We'll see what it's like after the Trump presidency. So my research has focused for many years on trauma, early life trauma particularly, and I thought I'll look that up in the Oxford English Dictionary. And trauma is described as a deeply distressing or disturbing experience. For example, a personal trauma like the death of a child. But actually in our society, the definition of trauma has become broader and broader. And I think we've become a little bit obsessed with trauma, but obsessed with its impact on us. That's my kind of, my stance at the beginning. And I'd like to see if you agree as we go forward. So listen, don't worry about this. If you can't get onto Menti, don't worry. This is just to try and help me tap into what some of you are thinking. So if you can find the website menti.com and use that code. And you should see, oh, maybe I haven't launched the slide yet. Okay. So we'll just give it a little pause and see what responses we get. Ooh, it's starting. This is exciting. The way this works is the biggest word means the most responses. Oh, sorry. 1758 6396. I'll just read that again. 1758 6396. This is fascinating. This is great. I'm getting you to do all the work. The biggest word seems to be pain. But there's also distress. Oh, distress is beating it. Okay, I think that's starting to settle. Anyway, if you haven't had a chance to respond, don't worry, because we'll go back to that. We'll have time for questions and you can discuss it. So we do know that trauma can lead to mental health problems. And this is another word cloud. We tend to think about post-traumatic stress disorder as being one of the main outcomes of trauma. Actually, depression, alcohol misuse of other substances are also common. But post-traumatic stress disorder is a fairly common and quite disabling outcome of severe trauma. And it's characterized by flashbacks and nightmares. In other words, intrusive thoughts. And the terrible thing about post-traumatic stress disorder, I've just realized I brought an example. Almost forgot I brought this. We like to organize our holiday photographs into books because we can never find them later. And this is what our brains do when we're processing memories. We organize them into kind of brain filing cabinets with timestamps. But in post-traumatic stress disorder, it's almost as if you've just thrown all your photographs into a drawer without sorting them. So what it means is that suddenly a photograph, an image, will pop into your head and you might as well still be there. So if you've had a horrible car accident and seen someone die beside you, then it can be as if suddenly you're there and it's as if you're still in that car accident because there's no date stamp on it. And it can be terribly disabling, and people can start to really shrink their worlds, because the other symptom is avoidance. We'll do anything to avoid these terrible symptoms. So people's worlds get smaller and smaller, and sometimes people can't leave their house or can't even leave their room. So there are significant negative outcomes that can be directly related to trauma. And some people seem to have an increased risk of very severe mental illness like schizophrenia or other forms of psychosis related to trauma. This was a review of more than 60 studies looking at early life adversity and psychosis, and I quote, there was a high prevalence of childhood trauma in first episode psychosis. So certainly in our society and in America, where most of the research has been done, there does seem to be an association between particularly childhood trauma and severe mental illness like psychosis. But that's where things get a bit intriguing. I'm going to move this glass because I will knock it over. So if you look at this graph, this map of the world, the dark blue areas are areas with lower rates of schizophrenia, and the red areas are areas with higher rates of schizophrenia. And actually, if you look, the wealthiest country in the world, the United States, has one of the highest rates of schizophrenia. And there have been critiques of this and saying that maybe the research hasn't been done well in lower income countries. But actually, there's been research on schizophrenia in sub-Saharan Africa for 50 years. So there's something interesting going on here. And then it gets even more intriguing. This is a map of adherence to children's rights across the world. And the dark areas are areas where children's rights are least well adhered to, where there are higher levels of child abuse and neglect. And it's the inverse. So actually, if you look at these two maps together, you seem to have lower rates of schizophrenia in areas of the world where you have higher rates of child maltreatment. So there's something funny going on there. So we definitely don't have a direct relationship between childhood trauma and severe mental illness like schizophrenia. But I think you don't start really wondering about these things until you have your own stories. And there are two stories that, in my own life, that have really made me think differently about this. So the first is a story of my colleague Ruchika Gajwani. So Ruchika is, Dr. Ruchika Gajwani is an Indian academic clinical psychologist. We work very closely together. And we've actually done a lot of work together on this topic. So Ruchika grew up in Delhi. And she grew up quite near a very, very dangerous roundabout. And it was such a dangerous roundabout that at one point somebody created a kind of sick joke. And they put a billboard up beside the roundabout. And they basically counted all of the fatalities. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 on this big billboard. So in other words, if you live near that roundabout, you would experience death on a regular basis. So Ruchika has many times described to me how she then moved to Birmingham, and she was sitting in a room full of clinical psychology trainees, and she was the only trainee that wasn't white English. And she suddenly realised that at that time, this was in the kind of 2000s, there was really an obsession in clinical psychology with trauma as the cause of everything. And she's sitting there thinking, but I'm the only person in this class who's ever seen a dead body. And yet, coming from India, it's a country where there isn't a higher rate of schizophrenia. So something just doesn't match here. And then I had an experience in one of my own studies that really shook me and kind of turned the data into human beings. So we ran a big study of a big randomized controlled trial of an intervention for babies and young children coming into foster care. And if you come into foster care in Scotland, you have to have experienced pretty severe adversity because, social workers in Glasgow don't take it lightly, removing children from their families. It has to be a very good reason. So virtually all of the children who'd come into our study had experienced severe abuse and neglect or other very severe adversities. And there was a little boy who was 2, and he was sent home by one of the teams that had assessed him. Sorry, he wasn't sent home by the team that had assessed him. He was recommended not to be sent home. So the very clear recommendation was that it would be dangerous to send that child home because the family wasn't safe. But the judge disagreed and sent the child home. And then 2 years later, that child came back into care and had been so badly beaten that he actually had to be an inpatient. And the lovely social worker phoned me up and said, Helen, this is a really unusual request, but clearly this boy who's now 4.5 is going to need some kind of therapy. Where should I send him? Would you mind having a look at all of the information that you collected and just give me some advice? So I did that, went back, we looked with the team, we looked at every single questionnaire, interview that had been done, we looked at the videos of his interaction with his foster carers. That boy had absolutely no symptoms of any mental health problem. So I was able to phone the social worker and say, listen, keep an eye on this child, but he absolutely does not need therapy. There's nothing to therap. And so the figures tell, I mean, I should have known that, because approximately half, slightly less than half of all of the children who came into that study had a psychiatric disorder or a neurodevelopmental condition. But of course, that means that half, or actually more than half, didn't. But somehow that just doesn't hit you on the head until you actually have an example of a particular child. So that really got me thinking. It really changed my thinking about trauma. I thought, this boy has undoubtedly experienced very severe trauma, and yet he's fine. And just around that time, I came across this wonderful paper called The Adaptive Calibration Model of Stress Responsivity. It came out in 2011, so it had been out for a few years when I came across it. But it has this wonderful quote. Children have evolved to respond in biologically adaptive ways to harsh and unsupportive family environments, not just to loving and supportive ones. Now, isn't that liberating? I mean, that does not mean we should be abusing our children. But that's a human rights issue. You know, children have a human right not to be abused and neglected. But what this is saying is that even if they are abused and neglected, actually they're adapted to withstand it. And that's where it gets really interesting. So, how does the human mind recover? And with her permission, I want to tell you the story of a friend of mine called Zem Moffat. So, a couple of years ago, Zem, who's a very fit woman, freshwater swimmer, cyclist, tall, strong, muscular woman, fell off her bicycle on Sauchiehall Street and broke her femur. And the femur is the major long bone in your thigh. Now, that is a serious injury. And she had to go into hospital and have it pinned, and the pain was excruciating. I mean, she describes it and it makes you shiver. I was on holiday when this happened, and we're good friends. So a couple of days after the accident, Zem texted me and she said, listen, Helen, you're a psychiatrist. Can I ask your advice? Because I'm having some really strange things happening. So, yeah, tell me about it. And basically, she was lying in her hospital bed. She'd had her surgery, and she would suddenly feel that she was going to fall off her bicycle again. And she was worried that she was kind of maybe going mad. But I explained to her that that's basically just the brain's way of sorting your memories. So basically, that's your brain's way of kind of processing all of this and organising your memories into something with a date and a time stamp. And so what I suggested to Zem is that from all of the research, it seems to be that the best thing to do after a trauma is basically to chat to people that you know and love. So I said, listen, if you'd like, send me some voice messages and just let me know how you're doing over the next few days. So that's what we started doing. I was actually down in Cambridge at the Cambridge Folk Festival, and pretty much every day I would get a voice message from Zem just saying, well, today, this is what happened. It's a bit better than yesterday. And then I would basically voice message her back. And I basically said to her, look, it's very likely that this is just part of your brain's healing. If you're still having symptoms in a few months, then you should think about doing something about it. And so Zen didn't have any symptoms in a few months until she tried to get on her bicycle. When she tried to get on her bike again, she started feeling that horrible falling sensation. And so she then went for some trauma treatment. She went and got a treatment called EMDR, and very quickly she was able to get back on her bike. So ordinary, just chatting with a friend helped for most of it, and then she actually did get some psychiatric, some psychological support. We have got a very sophisticated stress calibration system, and I like to try and put it across with a fairly kind of simple metaphor of a thermostat. So it's a bit like the thermostat in your house where you're trying to keep the temperature at a reasonable level. And this has been well researched. There's a couple of scientists called Yerkes and Dodson who researched this, and for some reason it's stuck in my head at medical school. I really like this idea that you need to actually get yourself kind of woken up in the morning before you're ready to go, because when you wake up, you're probably not quite ready to do differential calculus or to do your theory test if you're about to do your driving test. You need to actually kind of get up and have a shower and a cup of coffee. So in other words, you need to be a little bit more alert before you're in your kind of optimum flow state. But throughout life, for all of us, there will be moments when you experience trauma. I mean, that is a normal part of life. It could, for example, be a car accident. And when you experience an extreme sudden stress, you'll go into fight, flight, or freeze. And I mean, a car accident's a really good example, because some people will want to jump out of their car and beat up the person that bumped into them. Some people will want to literally run away before the police get there. Neither of those things are a good strategy, by the way, just in case. And then, last but not least, some people will just freeze. And I think in evolutionary terms, that's us kind of trying to play dead so that nobody's going to notice that we've really mucked up and we've had a car accident. But these responses are normal in extreme situations of stress. And so, none of us are likely to get through life without experiencing the death of a loved one. You may be shouted at by your boss. And in these situations, we're going to use the people that we love to get back into relaxation and restitution. So, somebody just pranged your car and you're shaky. What do? Generally what you do is you phone your loved ones. You phone your spouse, you might phone your mum, you phone your best friend. You're going to phone someone who can soothe you and get you back into restitution. And that happens over and over when bad things happen. And eventually, what that will develop in us is a healthy stress response system, a healthy kind of shock absorption system that's robust to challenges. And there is some evidence that it is helpful to have some shocks, and that actually if you've never experienced any trauma, then it can be really quite challenging if you do experience a trauma later in life. And really throughout life, we have different ways of developing the stress response system. So as babies, we need special adults to help us deal with trauma. So, your trauma might just be that you're very hungry. And so you'll cry and you want someone to pick you up and soothe you. And that's what babies need. They need to have parents or other special adults to do that. But as you go through life, we gradually learn to do it for ourselves. And I like this picture. This is actually an elderly woman in a Norwegian summer house. And she's got her way of getting into relaxation and restitution. Now, why am I showing you a picture of an MG midget? Well, simply because it's a really nice car. I mean, that has to be said. But the main reason is I want to just talk you through a shock absorption system. And a shock absorption system in an MG midget is a lot more simple than a shock absorption system in a human. You'll be glad to know. So this is just the front suspension components of an MG midget. I've shown you that just because you can see that there are various kind of springy bits that will allow you bumping along, just to absorb those those bumps as as you've got your Chanel scarf. So I'm really getting into this, but so that your Chanel scarf doesn't fly off as you go over a sleeping policeman on your way to Mulgai. So, I want to just get you for a moment thinking about what might be some of the components of our human shock absorption system. So in single words or up to 3-word phrases, what things, beings or organisations are the most important parts of our shock absorption system? I'll just get the slide up. That's weird. That seems to be the last one. How very strange. Oh, good. We're getting some shock absorption. Interesting. Friends, family, sleep, alcohol. Yeah, a nice glass of wine could be quite useful. You don't want too many, but support, therapist, writing. Someone's put forgetting. Now that's interesting, actually. I remember hearing a group of Ethiopian psychologists at a conference talking about structured forgetting, and it was so frustrating. They all went off for coffee, and I didn't get a chance to ask them what they meant. Talking. Therapist. Okay, great. I mean, I think this is giving us an idea. Oh, someone's put mum. Yeah. Mums are very good shock absorbers. As long as you like them. I can hear my daughter sniggering. Don't elaborate on that, Ellie, please. Great. No, thank you for that. I thought what we'd do now is just widen our perspective a little and try and get us thinking beyond the UK. And really just emphasising that in many parts of the world, a bit of good old pestilence is normal. My husband Steve is sitting there, and Steve grew up in Ohio. And in Ohio, every 17 years or so, there is a herd of locusts. And Steve has described in great disgusting detail how suddenly, it'll be summer and the sky will darken and there's this swarm of insects that just descend. And the trees in the bushes go from being lush summer trees and bushes to looking like winter trees and bushes because they just are eaten by this swarm. And then they crunch underfoot and this horrible stuff. Horrible. So it's back to our original picture. And of course, in medieval times, we believed that it was God that was smiting us with locusts. And you can see the locusts coming down from heaven here. And I actually had quite fun looking at these guys. I mean, you look at the guy in the pink, and he's trying to bat them off. And as is the guy in the blue. I think the guy in the yellow might be about to vomit. He looks as if he's looking for a sick bag. So basically, a swarm of locusts is a disgusting, horrible thing. But this is a medieval painting. I mean, this has been happening since time immemorial. So we are expecting, as a human species, we should expect a bit of pestilence from time to time. Well, we've all been through a COVID pandemic. And of course, there are parts of the modern world that experience more infections, more natural disasters than us, but also live in a way that evolutionary biologists think is more typical. And I have a dear friend and colleague, Dennis Ugrin, who he's an expert in suicide and self-harm. And he was really interested in this kind of obsession among suicide and self-harm experts that, is it all the internet? Is it because of the internet that certainly in the UK suicide rates are increasing in children year on year? And he thought and thought about how to test this, and he managed to get funding to go to Tanzania with his colleague, clinical psychologist Emma Woodhouse, and spend a month with a hunter-gatherer community who had no contact with urbanisation, no internet, no television, no phones. I once saw Harry Burns, our ex-chief medical officer, with a Maslow's hierarchy, and he had Wi-Fi on the bottom. So, but that is not, Wi-Fi is not in existence in Hadza communities. What Dennis found, so Dennis did, he conducted interviews with parents in that community, interviews about 106 children, he used something called the Development Wellbeing Assessment, which is a very well-validated interview measure for child and adolescent mental health. It's been used in very large studies across the UK and other parts of the world. And what he found was that in the Hadza community, children had very similar symptoms and traits to British children, but virtually none of them would have met criteria for a diagnosis because they weren't impaired. And he could only really speculate as to why, but he thought it was a lot to do with the fact that every adult in that community knows and keeps an eye out for every child. So from the age of about 18 months to 2 years, once children are mobile, they're just kind of out in the community. And Dennis described how people have a very laissez-faire attitude, but he never saw an adult shout at or hit a child the whole time he was there. Children take on much more responsibility. Dennis went hunting with a group of 4 to 8-year-old boys, hunting with poison arrows, and they were actually bringing home more calories than they could eat, so they were contributing towards the community. They were having such good fun. Adults work fewer hours. On average, adults work 4 to 5 hours a day, and the rest of the time people sit around and chat. That sounds like quite a nice life, doesn't it? Sarah Bluffer-Hardy is an evolutionary biologist who has very overtly tried to look at our evolution from a women and children's perspective. She's written 2 fantastic books, and I would recommend both of them. Her second one is called Mothers and Others, and it's all about the importance of people who are non-parental supporters in the community helping parents. She talks about allo-parents, and allo-parents can be grandparents, they can be aunts, they can be older siblings, male or female. And this is common in most communities. It's not common in Britain, and it's not common in much of the West. But really, we are collaborative, cooperative breeders. And unlike most other apes, we usually have 2 under 2. Having 2 children under 2 is completely common in our human species. If you have 2 children under 2, you cannot physically feed yourself and the children without help. That is just the situation. But we've forgotten that in our society. So who are the others who can help keep an eye out for our children with love? And I think that's a question that we need to be asking ourselves. Do we urgently need to be thinking beyond our nuclear families? I was actually teaching this morning, I was teaching the Masters in Global Mental Health course at Glasgow University, and it's the most wonderfully multicultural group of students. And there was a student from Nigeria and another student from Chile, and they were both talking about how in their cultures, you would never have a parent on their own looking after a child. It just wouldn't happen. So I want to give you an example. Steve and I recently went to Kyrgyzstan, which is a wonderful country in the middle of that great plain that crosses the bottom of the USSR, of what used to be the USSR, into China. And I was fascinated by the fact that many families in Kyrgyzstan take their herds up into the mountains and live in yurts during the summer. And yurts are, so basically these are temporary pieces of accommodation. It looked really complicated to put up. So let's just look at let's first of all look at how an Englishman puts up his yurt, remembering that an Englishman's home is his castle.
This to the top of the trellis, and then if you come there, make sure that's correctly positioned. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7,
He has a
8,
member of his
9,
nuclear family there to
10,
help him.
11, 12, 13, 14. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8,
Highly
9,
technical
10,
job.
11, 12, 13, 14. Tie roof pole number 2 in the right place, and then at this point it's a one-person job, so it's best to ask if your assistant would stand out the way, and then you take the roof pole
She's banished.
and
Poor
push
soul.
the wheel up into the
It's
air.
no longer necessary.
This to the top of the trellis.
Okay, enough of our
Make
English
sure
woman
that's
putting
correctly
up his
positioned.
yurt.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9.
Now let's see how it's done in Kyrgyzstan. Find some friends.
Kızılcık tükenmek için bakan da oldu.
Do you hear anyone
Kontrol evet tegerek.
Let's check the
Peki kaptanına gelsinler yaptı. Köy ortasına attı.
Doesn't that look fun? And I bet everyone goes off and gets afterwards. So let's do the same Menti again. And let's see what we get this time. There we go. Oh, hang on, let me present that. Okay. It's coming. Can you... Sorry?
The thing's popping up on the stream. I'll get that over for you.
Okay. Oops. I wonder if I've got the wrong slide up here. Let me see. Oh no, I've got some responses apparently. Ah, here we are. There we go.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay.
Thank you. Someone said that a yurt is one of the most important parts. It was great. We stayed in a yurt and it was so cozy. Community. Oh, how interesting. De-individualization, someone's written. Religion. We're getting a wider... But we've still got friends and family. Friends and family are still up there, but community's coming up there too. How interesting. I wasn't sure how this would work. I thought we might get exactly the same as before, but dogs, somebody's put. Playing, time, relaxation, using your hands. Yeah. That's been interesting, actually, just seeing how that changed once we kind of got out of our box a little bit, out of our UK box. So, don't worry, I'm not going to go through the MG Midgets shock absorption system again. I think you've done enough of that. But I want to get you thinking now about our human shock absorption system. And actually, a group of us have been thinking about this for a number of years. We haven't managed to get anyone to fund us yet to do research. So if any of you have Texan millionaire aunties and want to give us the money to do that, then that would be great. But we've got this really multidisciplinary group with stress response experts, epigeneticists, geneticists, psychiatrists, anthropologists, and we've all been trying to think about what is our human shock absorption system? What is it that helps us cope with particularly severe traumas like abuse and neglect. And we've come up with what is going to look like an overwhelming diagram, but I'll talk you through it. So this is the diagram that we've come up with. And we talk about the brain, the human brain, as being the control centre for this. But it's only the control centre in a kind of non-thinking way. I'm not talking about the thinking brain. I'm talking about the kind of lizard brain down at the basal parts of the brain here. So if you have a car accident, then that part of the brain spits out signals to your adrenal glands, which are just above your kidneys. And those glands will then spit out hormones, stress hormones, so adrenaline, cortisol. A lot of research on cortisol and how we differentially secrete it. One of the things we've when I say we, what other scientists have discovered is that the stress response system and the immune system are actually the same system. They're really intimately linked. And I think you'll know that, any of you who have been in a very stressful work situation and then you go on holiday and you immediately get sick. It's so annoying, but it happens again and again because your immune system goes on holiday and then, So these stress responses and immune responses are very intimately linked. Your microbiome, which is all of the bacteria in your gut, are also intimately linked. Now, please don't ask me how, because I don't understand it. But there's people in our group who do. But suffice it to say that we've got 25,000 genes in our bodies, but if you take all of the bacteria in your gut, then I think you've got something like 300 million genes. So it's not just our own genetics that are working on all of this processing, but our own genetics will probably determine the type of stress responder that we are, along with our experience. And what we've shown, we've done a systematic review looking at this, and what we found was that most of us are kind of moderate stress responders, but maybe 10 to 15% are up-regulators and maybe 10 to 15% are down-regulators. So some of us in a stressful situation, it's probably to do partly with experience, partly with genetics. In a stressful situation, we're up-regulating, we're outwards, and some of us in a really stressful situation will kind of collapse in on ourselves and get quieter. And that's where we've argued that your whole social system is also deeply interconnected. And the way I like to explain this to myself is if you imagine a child in a classroom who's an up-regulator and somebody says something really nasty to that child, if you're an up-regulator, you might get up and shout, or you might even throw a chair. If you're a down-regulator, then you're probably going to go even quieter. And of course, the way the teacher responds, and later on in life, the way the police respond, is going to differ according to what kind of regulator you are. And so you're going to have a different social world depending on how you regulate. So this is all interconnected. And in some ways that can feel overwhelming, but I think what's quite exciting about it is it means that there's lots of different ways that we could intervene to help people with their stress responses. And of course, in many poorer countries, shocks are much, for example, from natural disasters, sudden economic disasters or war, are much more common than they are in the UK. We're so lucky to have a temperate climate here. So far. But I do wonder increasingly, I ask myself, might our mental health actually be more robust if we were more familiar with overcoming traumas? And one of the things that's made me think about this is actually a story about my own mother. So it's a very isolating experience in Britain in 2025 to have the kind of extreme trauma that's in the Oxford definition, to have the death of a child. But my mum, who died in 2019 at the age of 89, was a child in the 1930s. And she talked about the experience of a family of 4 children all dying in 1 week from diphtheria, which of course is a terrible, terrible trauma. But what it made me realise was that in her generation, if you had a child who died, the chances were you would know someone who'd had a child who died. And the experience that you hear, that we hear as psychiatrists, child psychiatrists, for example, of parents whose children have died is often people who've been close friends or even family will cross the street to avoid them because we don't know how to talk to people who've experienced major trauma. We just are not experienced enough. So it's terribly isolating now in a way that it wasn't, I think, in the same way in the 1930s. Which brings me on to the only kind of philosophical concept that I'm going to use, the kind of formal philosophical concept, which is memento mori. And memento mori is the reminder of death. It's the whole idea that if we remind ourselves of death, it can make us feel more alive. And as Albert Camus said, there's only one liberty: to come to terms with death. Thereafter, anything is possible. And I think when I think of my mum, she really wasn't afraid of death. And she died at the age of 89. And in the previous year, she had really lived. She'd actually been over to Sweden with me to see me lecture. And we had a rare old time, we really did. And I think she used to say during that fight, that the final year of her life, I don't really want to be 90, to be honest. So, you know, she had a really great arc of life and a good death. And I think that is not a coincidence that she wasn't afraid of death. And that probably had something to do with having grown up at a time when death was much more present. And actually the Egyptians, apparently, I'm not sure whether this is apocryphal or true, but apparently the Egyptians at major feasts would sometimes bring in a corpse, just to remind everyone that they were alive. So we are alive, so let's eat, drink, and be merry. I wanted to just ask ourselves the question, are we fragile? And the whole idea of fragility has really started to kind of enter our conversation over the last few years. And I don't know whether it was this book that started it, but there's a book called White Fragility that was written in 2019 by Robin DiAngelo. And she introduced the phrase white fragility, a state in which even a minimum amount of racial stress, in this case she was talking about, becomes intolerable. So she was talking about white people being accused of being racist and finding it intolerable. And that would trigger a range of defensive moves and often would trigger aggression. And this concept has been widened out beyond the idea of discussions about racism. So this is an article that I came across about a potential link between toxic masculinity and fragility. And it says, I wonder what it would be like to develop a similar idea around masculinity, somehow speaking to the fragility that's at the heart of toxic masculinity, the idea that it's a kind of defensive, don't attack me, you know, but actually that comes from a deep insecurity. So I guess I just wonder, is our fragility making us more mentally ill as a society? And can overcoming experiences of trauma allow us to embrace life more fully? And another story I want to tell you is about my friend Brendan. So Brendan is an extremely fit, early 40-something who grew up in a materially deprived part of Glasgow that's also got a lot of, or at the time when he was growing up, had a lot of knife crime. And he literally, at the age of 18, was stabbed within an inch of his life, literally, and was in intensive care. It wasn't clear whether he was going to live or die, but he got through it. Now, Brendan is one of the most life-embracing people you could meet. Lovely guy, he's got a lovely family. And so anyway, I was telling him about the fact I was going to do this lecture, and I said, have you heard about this idea of memento mori, which I have to say was a new concept to me until recently. And he looked at me wryly and rolled up his sleeve. He has memento mori tattooed on his left arm as a constant reminder that he's alive. He nearly died, but he's alive. And it was just wonderful. I mean, how unexpected. And he gave me permission to share his left arm with you. And we are honoured to see it. My own experience of memento mori is an interesting one. 15 years ago, I had a diagnosis of breast cancer. Now, I was lucky to have it diagnosed early. I had excellent treatment from the NHS, very rapid mastectomy, chemotherapy, and the expectation that, you know, I was presented with this would be curative, and so far so good. But there was a very brief moment where I faced death in a very real way. So the surgeon mentioned that she told me that I had, that she'd diagnosed breast cancer. She'd just done a biopsy, and she said, I'm just going to nip out and get your case notes. Just before she nipped out, she said, by the way, you've got 3 tumours. So this is how my thought processes went. I thought, 3 tumours? That means that the cancer's spread. That means I have stage 4 cancer. That means that I must be terminally ill. Shit. Why me? And then, literally within the space of about 2 heartbeats, a completely different train of thought came into my head, and it was, actually, why not me? I'm 48 as I was then. I'm 48. I've had an amazing life. I've travelled. I've got an amazing family. I've got great friends. I really can't complain. I've had really quite a life. And that was my shock absorption system kicking in. It was quite remarkable. I mean, literally to go from utter devastation to, do you know what, we'll cope with this. And that's what the body and the mind does. It's quite incredible. And I think, luckily, then the surgeon came back in and said, by the way, your 3 tumours are all in one small area of the breast, and it really won't increase your risk very much at all. And it was like, oh, right. I felt like a right idiot. But for that very brief minute or so, I faced death. And, you know, for the next 2 years, I was as relaxed and unstressed as I've ever been in my life. It was just like, do you know, I went to the library and I wrote to everyone saying, I'm really sorry I can't be on your boring committee because I've just had a diagnosis of breast cancer. Sorry, I'm not going to be able to finish that boring report because and it was just like, you know, you could slough off all the rubbish and just concentrate on the important things. And, you know, that feeling doesn't last forever, but it doesn't completely go away either. And so just to kind of start to draw things to a close, I want to introduce you to Dr. Harry Hussey, PhD. Now, Dr. Harry Hussey is 95, turned 95 in September, and 18 months ago, at the age of 93, he got his PhD with no corrections in building estimation. He's a completely incredible guy. He is a lesson in facing trauma and embracing joy. Harry was born in 1929 to a working class family from Kilburn in North London. His father was a coalman. He joined his dad as a coalman at the age of 14 and then simultaneously started playing the accordion in local pubs and clubs. He then went into the building trade. He was married young and divorced young. So, I mean, some tough times. Lived through a world war. So yeah, he's had his ups and downs. But Harry is an absolute lesson in really just embracing the ups and downs of life. And Graham said you weren't going to hear me sing. You are going to very briefly hear me sing because me and Harry have a trio with my daughter Ellie. And when Ellie lived in San Francisco, and when she came back to the UK, she'd had a major relationship breakup and was really sad. And around the same time, Harry's wife had died. Now, I'd met Pat many times. She was a wonderful woman. They were clearly madly in love, and he was devastated. And shortly after Pat died, we got back together and started making music. And I was thinking, he's not going to want to make music. I could not have been more wrong. And I'm going to play you a very short clip of us singing a particularly sad song that Harry taught us. And just watch the sadness in Ellie and Harry's eyes.
Someday all my prayers are answered. I'll hear footsteps on the stair. With anxious heart I'll hurry to the door, and maybe you'll be there.
Oh, it was a very slightly ropey rehearsal, but But it was really moving watching the relationship between the three of us, but particularly between Ellie and Harry. Sometimes, you know, just with tears, and just really facing the pain and working through it. Harry is now madly in love again, and we sing a lot happier songs now, don't we? Every time we get together, he teaches us new songs. And oops. Harry was actually, some of you may have seen him because he was in the television programme, The Piano, with Claudia Winkleman, and he actually won the Christmas episode one year. So there's a little clip of Harry with Claudia Winkleman.
Well, my name is Harry Hussey.
Lift has arrived. Doors will open shortly.
Do you mind? I was doing the talking.
You look very chic.
You can stay. You can definitely stay. When I sit down and play the piano, it's usually because I want to block everything out of my mind. And you can't play the piano if you're thinking about something else. To me, it's like going on holiday.
Marsha Linehan, famous clinical psychologist, says, by refusing to accept the misery that's part of climbing out of hell, you fall back into hell. And we won't all get to live to 95, but I do wonder if, for the sake of our mental health, we maybe need to further develop our shock absorption systems. And this is really a question for you. I mean, I don't know the answer to this, but perhaps do we need to be taking more risks? Do we need to be meeting a more diverse range of people who are going to challenge us? Do we need to be embracing a more diverse range of experiences? I hate the term underdevelopment in the term that's used in Wikipedia. An underdeveloped state, according to Wiki, is framed as the antithesis of a developed, modern, industrialised state. Well, I actually wonder whether industrialised states like the UK are really the undeveloped states. Is an underdeveloped state a country in which we, as increasingly isolated and fragile people, have forgotten that trauma is normal and have forgotten how to forge relationships with our extended families, our neighbours, so that they can help us when times are tough? If so, how do we redevelop? Do we need to embrace trauma as a normal part of life? Do we need to be more comfortable with talking about trauma without drama? Without expectations that experiences of trauma will inevitably lead to terrible outcomes? What do you think?
Sure, that's a talk that must have raised thoughts, given that it applies to all of us. Any questions or comments? Ellie. This has to be about the talk, Ellie.
First of all, body the talk, Mom. I know that's right. Hey, that's No, my question is this, right? So, obviously, I'm a young person, and I wonder if you think that young people are too obsessed with therapy and feeling like therapy is going to be the one thing that will solve all of their problems. Yeah. On the flip side, obviously recognizing that mental health is a real thing, how do you sort of
Yeah. Such a good question. I mean, so good therapy, skilled therapy for the right problem is just crucial. You know, think of Zem's story. Do you know, trauma-focused cognitive behavioural therapy, EMDR, it can save a life. There's just no two ways about it. But poor therapy for the wrong problem or for a non-problem, I think, can be really damaging. I mean, there's actually research that shows that in post-traumatic stress disorder, having experts kind of fly in after a natural disaster and kind of therapy everyone is harmful. There's actually been randomised controlled trials showing that. And I've always felt that, you know, in that circumstance, when you're going through that sorting of memories, probably what you need is soup with an auntie or, you know, somebody in your community.
I know that in Gaza, not now, but previously, where there was an influx of experts on PTSD, and they had to be shown the door because the treatment was groups, local groups, because it was a social problem. It wasn't an individual problem.
Exactly.
Sorry, any more questions? Over here.
I think I read in the press very recently that something like 20%.
No, somebody's not here.
It should be green.
It's green.
Holler. Holler into it.
Any better? Can you hear me? Okay. I read in the press recently that something like 20% of young people of working age are off sick with mental health problems. Is this a fashion statement, or are they likely to be mentally ill given the environment they're in?
Phew, that's such a big question. I don't think it is just a fashion statement. I think increasing numbers of people are experiencing genuine mental health problems. And for me, the big thing is social isolation. I have a colleague who's a health visitor, and she works with the Family Nurse Partnership that works with young mothers who are often single parents. And she says the biggest problem for particularly mothers with postnatal depression is social isolation. You know, I was discussing that with the class today, the global mental health class, and, you know, students who come from more collective societies were just shocked that a mother would be isolated just after having a baby. So I think there is something real going on. I mean, I'm not saying that there isn't. I think in some situations there is also a kind of blurring of the boundaries between mental illness and kind of concern about traits which probably could be managed with support. But for me, the big problem is lack of social support.
Yeah. Can we try the microphone at the back and see if that works?
I'll just test it again. Can you hear me?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Thank you very much for that very excellent talk. I enjoyed it thoroughly. Just a question about Harry Hussey. And I was wondering whether or not anyone has tried identifying his shock absorbers.
Yeah. Well, I think, so it's interesting. I mean, Harry's a friend, and I work with geneticists and epigeneticists. And actually, to be honest, I think Harry's the kind of guy that he'd be quite happy if they wanted to take 20 mils of blood and look at his DNA. Yeah, maybe I should suggest it. I think knowing Harry, what is really striking is his love of music. And actually, he really loves knitting as well. He's someone that's just really, really life-loving. He just bites off life. And it's interesting because at his wife's funeral, and I did ask his permission to talk about it, and by the way, he was delighted. At his wife's funeral, I met people who'd known him all his life. Well, actually known him all his life because he was the eldest person there. But I think he hadn't always been that. You know, he hadn't always been the person with kind of joie de vivre, and I think that has been something that's been earned. So,
at the back.
Thanks for that talk. It was really interesting. I just want to ask about how we can all encounter the same experience but have a different response to it.
Yeah.
And I know you talked about how our stress responders are so different. But I think that can then also lead to a really, really negative narrative, that you stay stuck in that negative trauma so much that it feeds into every other linchpin of your life. And I'm just thinking of it from my own family's experience, that the narrative is so deep that they can't find any sense of being their true authentic self because their low self-esteem has lost that. And I think society right now doesn't give permission for people to be authentic because we're all so busy comparing each other, and we never have a childhood to keep that resilience going, where you need to build your own internal world to then know what you're going to bounce on or off in life. And I think young people are swamped because they haven't got that internal, authentic narrative anymore. I don't know.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of really important things I think you touched on there. I'm going to come to authenticity in a moment because it's really important. But the first thing you were asking about, is that thing of why can two people have a really different response to the same stress? And I think the answer, undoubtedly, is both nature and nurture. So maybe touching on nature first, it's maybe helpful to think of, for example, somebody who's neurodivergent, somebody with ADHD, for example. ADHD can be all positive, especially if you are being reared in a family that has enough resources to cope with your hyperactivity, your demands, your impulsivity. But if you're in a family that is living in poverty and has many, many additional stresses, then that same hyperactive, joyful child could be extremely burdensome for a very, very stressed parent. So I think it is really nature and nurture that can get you into a kind of vicious or a virtuous cycle. Because some people who are neurodivergent, for example, are extremely resilient, but that's often the luck of where they've landed up. But I think there's something about authenticity that you say that's really interesting and important, because I think one of the things we've got really poor at in our society is allowing people to actually say, my life is absolutely shit at the moment, it's terrible, and I really need help. And I think if we're able to do that, then people are willing to help. A cousin of ours, she's Albanian, she's married into the family. But she went back to Albania recently, and one of her friends says, you're not Albanian anymore because you don't ask for help. And she realised that to really fit in the close that she was living in, she needed to start asking her neighbours for sugar and things, even if she didn't need it, because it's about reaching out and asking for support in the community. But I find in Glasgow, that working class communities are much, much more open to you saying something terrible's happened in my life, and folk will just say, well, life's a bitch. Because people have actually realised that there's an embracing of trauma as normal. But I think in middle-class societies often, there's this tendency where we're supposed to kind of pretend that life is all perfect, which I think is really damaging.
And it reminded me of his famous book, The Outsider, and the character in it who was vilified for not being bothered enough to attend his own mother's funeral. And what that made me think about is it the case in maybe more so-called developed societies that there's a greater expectation of behaviour? And that greater expectation of how you should behave could increase trauma and could increase the definition of mental illness compared with the so-called less developed societies where there's perhaps less rules, regulations and expectations.
I think there's something really important in what you said there. And what I think, going back to my colleague Dennis Ugren's experience with the Hadza community, the hunter-gatherer community, it's not even so much about expectations, it's about a recognition of a very wide range of behaviour. So, he described a little girl who he was pretty sure had Rett's syndrome, and Rett's is quite a severe degenerative genetic disorder that is characterised by very severe autistic traits, intellectual disabilities. Now, that little girl was just expected to kind of bump along with the other kids. And she really did not seem at that stage to be impaired. But what really struck me was that the adults would then see that children with different intellectual abilities, different levels of activity, different appetites are all children. And I think one of the problems in our society is that we're all in our nuclear families behind four walls. And so we think there's a normal. We're not quite sure what it is, but we know that we're supposed to adhere to it.
Helen, thank you. Thinking of that wonderful busy slide and thinking of the very integrative way that you're talking about nature and nurture, and thinking about medicine rather than just psychiatry or psychology, do you think there's a danger that with an over-focus on the variables of what precision medicine is looking at, that it's potentially a bit imbalanced and over-focusing on the biological or the constitutional rather than the nurture side of that equation?
Oddly enough, I think we really do need to be both and, because I think we need to recognise that, I think I recognise more and more in my career that the nurture side is actually a lot less powerful than I thought. So I remember Robert Plomin, seeing the great behavioural geneticist Robert Plomin present when I had one child, and he said, you're not going to believe in genetics until you have 2 children. And then I had a second child, and it was like, whoa, I see what he means. You know, just my kids are so temperamentally different. And I don't agree wholly with this statement, but I partially agree with it. He said parents matter, but don't make a difference. Now, I think actually if children have difficulties, then parents make a big difference. But when it comes to things like, you know, do you give your children organic food? Are you the kind of parent that really cares about bedtimes? Are you the kind of parent that allows your child to ride on their bike or not? Those kind of things actually really don't make much difference to how children turn out. Genetics is a lot more important than I think we'd realised. That said, I think what we're really poor at is realising that the mind and the body are completely connected. It is just one system. So, you know, if we get angry and we shout at someone, there's actually a chemical reaction going on in our head. So it's not about just thinking about the biology or just thinking about the psychology. It's about realising that they are all one same thing, and we need to just understand that we are a system, and we are a system that exists within other systems with other human beings and communities. And I don't know if that answers your question.
I remember reading that the explanation of the differences between siblings is that nature always spreads its bets.
Yes. Yeah.
Please.
Professor, it was a very interesting talk, and I think it came out of your slides that many people were identifying. Yeah, many people were identifying the importance of community, family, and so on. And there seems to be substantial evidence that that's maybe not so important in Western societies, put broadly, than in the other communities that your colleagues have studied. Looking forward, are you able to be a little bit more prescriptive for the future, given that there's a big social problem arising, and this room, with all due respect to me and our other friends here, are a good sign of it, a lot of elderly or getting elderly people, and how is that going to be handled? Is it going to be handled by people going into institutional care, or are we going to adopt some of the models from traditional societies where old people were, in fact, in Scotland was the case for many generations, were part of the family and cared for the family until the day they passed, and whether that is something that maybe Absolutely. Your studies will lead to some answers to?
I think we need to value older people. We really need to recognise that people who don't currently have the care of young children are absolutely crucial in supporting young people. And somehow we're losing that. There's an amazing third sector organisation called Be in Unity that we're doing some work with. And they're mainly, actually, their volunteers are mainly army veterans. And what they do is they go into schools and children who are finding it difficult to access the curriculum, some of those children spend a lot of the day in the local care home for elderly people, and just building relationships. And I think one of the things we really could do is focus on cross-generational relationships, and actually realise that aunties, grandmas, neighbours, old and young, are really, really important parts of society, and that we all need to be mucking in, supporting parents to support their children. And I think if we do that, then it will also help to solve the problem of caring for elderly people, because we should all be, as a community, doing that together.
I've got a question I'd like to ask you. You showed a slide at the beginning, or near the beginning, where you showed that in a country like the United States, there's a very high level, apparently, of schizophrenia, but a low level of childhood deprivation, and the reverse in Africa. But what I wondered was how you control for access to a diagnosis. And it's also possible that in the US it's overdiagnosed. But in Africa, people can't get a diagnosis.
I think that's important, and that has been a critique of the literature. And I think much of that kind of global analysis has been based on epidemiological studies where they've used standardised tools. But I think if you talk to most psychiatrists, actually in most societies, the prevalence of schizophrenia is about 1%. So it probably doesn't vary as much as it does on those slides. But there isn't any evidence that across the world, countries with higher levels of abuse and neglect have higher levels of schizophrenia. So it is a real conundrum, however you cut it, really.
Just for information, the oldest man to climb all the Scottish Munros was aged 82.
Really?
And he started it when he was 80.
So my sister's done half, and you're a young thing compared to that, so loads of time, Natalie.
Hi, I just wanted to ask, has there ever been any research on the impact of the internet on society's mental health? Because I feel personally that the internet has a lot to do with mental health.
So it was that question that really encouraged Dennis Ugarin to go and do that assessment of mental health in the Hadza communities. The problem is, it's very difficult to divorce the internet from other aspects of urbanisation, really. Although I think there was a study recently. Now, how did they do it? There was actually a randomised controlled trial in Denmark, and I'd struggle to find you I think it was very recent, actually, where they managed to convince young people to turn off the internet, and it did improve their mental health within the space of a couple of weeks. So I think there is some emerging evidence. It's really interesting because I was talking to Dennis Ugarin about that, and he was like, I tried that and I couldn't get the kids to stop the internet. So they must behave a lot more in Denmark. But I mean, I think there's no doubt that children and parents being on screens is a problem. But whether it's a cause or a symptom is a question for me. If we had the kind of communities that like when I go to the Bahamas, for example, which is where my family are from, my extended family, I mean, to be honest, you'd be so busy visiting relatives, you probably wouldn't have much time to be on the internet. I mean, you wouldn't have as much time to be on the internet. Good question. They certainly don't have better physical health because they're using the appalling American medical system. That's a good question. I don't know about the prevalence of mental health problems in the Bahamas.
Sir, please.
Yeah, online question. You've talked about nature and nurture, but what are the implications for adopted children in our current society who have come from a background of trauma and unknown early life?
Yes, that's a really good question. And I work a lot with adoptive parents, actually. And I think back at the beginning of my career, I used to generally think that if they'd... first of all, I should say that for adoptive families, there's a bit of the rule of thirds that happens. So about a third of adoptive families seem to be absolutely fine. The children don't have any mental health problems to speak of. About a third have some mental health problems, and about a third have real struggles, and actually there's a chance of adoption breakdown. So that's important. There is a spread. But for families where there are mental health problems, I used to assume that this was trauma-related, it was caused by trauma. And our research has started to suggest that it's really unclear often which is the chicken, which is the egg. Sometimes these are children who probably would have really thrived had they been born into families that had the resources to support them. And interestingly, like, so Glasgow City Council social work, for example, has become really interested in the interplay between poverty and neurodivergence, because this may, well, really understanding neurodivergence and helping families sooner might be a way of actually avoiding children having to come into care. But we really have to get much better at helping families sooner. So it's a complex answer to a complex question, but it's not as simple as we used to think.
Please. Hi, can I just ask a nerdy question, please?
Oh, please, I love a nerdy question.
All right. You spoke about randomised trials. So how do you control your active side, and what do you do for your control side?
Yeah, so we do what we call pragmatic trials. We try to do trials that are as near to the real world as possible. And it's the randomisation itself that creates the balance. So the way I've described, in fact, this is a great way to explain it. Many of you will be sitting beside friends. You'll be sitting beside people who maybe are more like you than other people in the room. I once did a talk where there were lawyers and social workers, and all the lawyers were sitting in one part of the room. So if you randomise, you spread the lawyers through the room like chocolate chips and cookie dough. It's like stirring the cookie dough. And then if you divide it down the middle and put an intervention to one side, you should have identical groups. So that's basically, and that's why I think randomised controlled trials are really good for really complex situations, because you don't have to worry about whether you've got the right number of lawyers. I don't know if that answers your question. What do we give? So we give the control services as usual, and again, that is often very messy. It's often very heterogeneous. So we've got a study just now where we've got 18 sites across the UK, and services as usual. This is actually an intervention, a therapeutic intervention for adopted children. And services as usual is an absolute postcode lottery, but that is just the situation across the UK. So we're basically comparing something that we're introducing with as near to the real world as we can get. That was a really good nerdy question. I love a proper nerdy question.
Hi, thank you very much. Just as you were speaking, I was wondering how much the differences we see between countries also relate to relative differences. So this idea of, you know, perhaps in developed nations, there's more of a relative poverty makes more of a difference, can make you feel more isolated, more othered, whereas perhaps in some less developed communities, yes, there's more community, but there's also more homogeneity, which
100%
maybe plays into that. So I don't know how much.
So important. It's almost as if we've forgotten about. I mean, you know, Graham, your team, you know, you did a lot of work on relative poverty, and I mean, it's almost as if we've forgotten about it. It's so important. And I worked, you know, as Graham said, I worked in Guatemala. And you really saw that in Guatemala, where we lived. Local families were extremely poor, but because we were on the side of a beautiful river, it was also the playground of the rich. So every bank holiday, you'd have people who literally would have jet skis and sometimes helicopters. And that is a horrible situation, to see that level of kind of devil-may-care riches. But of course, you get that in Glasgow. You know, I had a boyfriend who was from Drumchapel, and he lived in the part of Drumchapel where you had to come through the kind of poplar-lined avenues of Bearsden to get to his house. And there is something really difficult about seeing riches, I think. But then I also think there's something about the kind of community support if you live in somewhere where everyone is less well off. So Steve, my husband, worked in Botswana and described how in Swana culture, if somebody's hungry and is given pleche, which is the kind of staple food, the first thing they'll do is share it. And I think there's something about that. If everyone is poor, then there's no shame in it, because next week you'll be poor. So I'm poor this week, but I think there's a terrible, terrible shaming of poverty in rich countries that's very, very damaging.
Yes, I've heard some research that suggests that people who have a severe trauma, maybe a very bad accident and maybe lose limbs, there's some research that a couple of years later, they're actually happier than they were before the accident. Does that coincide with your thesis, or is there any real evidence to back that view up?
Well, there is emerging evidence for something that is called post-traumatic growth. And I think that can happen. I think it links to that whole memento mori concept where, you know, if you've kind of been within an inch of your life, then certain things that might have bothered you before maybe bother you less. That is also balanced against, you know, I mean, I don't want to minimize the fact that, you know, I have a dear, dear friend whose son died from suicide a couple of years ago. And I mean, she is crushed by it at the moment. And I really hope she comes out the other side. But it is in some ways to do with the nature of the trauma, the stigma around it. So many factors determine whether we can thrive after trauma or whether we are crushed by it.
One last one.
Perhaps I can take you back to something that was first raised, I think, in the very first question, which is really, I think, the public interest dimension of what the mental health landscape is today. I mean, I think the statistic of 20% of young people of working age not in the employment market is one of those statistics. I think there was another on the news today that benefits for people of working age who are not in the workforce to now reach 65 billion. And we're awaiting a new government policy about what they're going to be able to do about it. And there are other statistics which I don't have to hand, but they are that the largest growing group of those out of work people who are of working age are the 18 to 25-year-old group. And the largest area of health issues for them not working is mental health. It also seems that, you know, we have growing levels of diagnosis of neurodiversity. I think it's now 20% of children in Scotland in universities and schools requiring who's diagnosed with special needs for exam purposes, and in England it's a third, and a huge area apparently of unmet resources for special needs. It's, you know, it seems a very depressing landscape, and I think the politicians are going to be turning to people like you to provide both the diagnosis and the possible solution. What do you think you can say?
I mean, I think there are many potential solutions. One of the things that my colleague Dennis's research has really made me think about is the fact that those of us who are working ridiculous hours. And those of us who are not working, and it's just craziness. And, you know, there seems to be, there's a kind of presentism, and it's supposed to be, I've heard it's particularly bad in Britain and America, where there's a kind of expectation that it's not good enough to stay till 6. Why are you not there till 7? Why are you not in at 7? And when you think about it, you know, really, why do we not reduce? There's been some really interesting studies recently of 4-day weeks. And there was a trial in England, and I think something like 60% of the firms who did it have kept 4-day weeks because they actually get better productivity. Wouldn't it be great if we could get our society back to a situation where most people are working fewer hours, can sit around and chat with their neighbours' children? You know, I think that would be a really big step one. But how do we achieve that? That's the question, and that's too big a question for me.
Okay. It's 9 o'clock, so I'll draw the session to a close. What a wealth of information Helen has brought us. You know, evidence-based, anecdote, personal, from Glasgow, from the UK, from the world, an astonishing range of information on issues that are very much close to home for all of us in terms of the nature of trauma, whether we see it negatively or positively, the importance of connectivity. You reminded me, as a medical student, of being told that it was important for children to play in the dirt because they would acquire lots of infections that were better to acquire when they were kids and not when they were adults. I remember being taught that suicides was lower in Northern Ireland during the Troubles.
Interesting.
Because people were living exciting lives, and they went up again when the Troubles went away. And I'm sure many of you have found things in Helen's talk that ring a bell and make you think, and I'm sure we will all be thinking about this talk in the next few days and reflecting on it. So it's my job to present Helen with a wee memento, a paperweight from the Society.
Ooh, lovely.
But please also thank her in the usual way.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Ooh, that's beautiful. Oh, lovely. Thank you.
And we meet again in a fortnight on the 5th of February when Lorna Dawson from James Hutton Institute in Aberdeen will be talking about Earth and Ecological Sciences, Natural Justice. And if you can, please stay and have a glass of wine or a soft drink with us in the foyer.